CA here, and I'm going to take on the NonSequitur challenge of questions that Christians supposedly can't answer. So, let's see what we got in store.
If God is going to be posited for an explanation for human existence, then by what mechanisms, meaning by what activities and interactions that are organized in such a way that produced humans, did God use? And by what means could we discover those mechanisms?
By evolution, for one, of which can be determined by the biblical text as well as natural sciences, especially when the text says, "Let the earth bring forth these things" that are mentioned in Genesis chapter 1, for example. There are at least 2 to 3 perspectives in the theistic evolution camp, and the guys over at Sentinel Apologetics seem to be able to explain human evolution by arguing from both the Bible and science a lot better than I can. So, besides the adiaphora debate I have between them, there would be the answer ultimately concerning your question.
Among even the most fundamentalist of Christians, there are always people who interpret some part of the Bible metaphorically. Like in the book of Job, they talk about the 4 corners of the earth. Even fundamentalist Christians, for the most part, interpret that as metaphorical because we know there are no 4 corners of the earth. So when we find something in the Bible that doesn't necessarily reflect fact when interpreted literally, how can we definitively tell that that was intended to be interpreted metaphorically and not literally and is actually a falsehood?
Now, concerning the genetically modified skeptic's approach on this, I must say he's probably used to your usual apologist. However, there has been research done since the 90s, at least, that demonstrates the early ideas of science that the Israelites had. As Michael Heiser notes, he says the following, quote, "What about the pre-scientific cosmology of the Bible? For the biblical writers, the earth was flat and round, supported by pillars and supported by water. The water was held in place by the edges of the solid dome that covered the earth. Thus, what happened was God used the ancient Israelites' science and used it to relay theological truths." Again, as Heiser notes, the Bible's pre-scientific cosmology is what it is because God decided to prompt people who lived in a pre-scientific age to produce the books of the Bible, not because the earth is really round and flat with a solid dome over it. God didn't ask the people he picked to be something they weren't, modern scientists who understood celestial mechanics. He prompted them via his spirit to tell them some important truths. All we know was created by God, including us, and so we are accountable to him and dependent on him for life beating his terrestrial existence. The biblical writers didn't need a modern science education to communicate through their own worldview frame of reference and symbolic metaphors, well known throughout the context of the ancient world, their cultural context specifically, who the true creator was and why it mattered. That's taking the Bible for what it is and interpreting it in light of its own context, not ours. So we should interpret some passages literal and understanding, but as well as focus on the entirety of context. Ultimately, we must read the Bible as if we were either ancient Israelites or first century Christians. Meaning, while some verses must be interpreted or understood as literal, there's also paragraphs that read literal, but the theme is about monotheism, for the most part, as well as the different genres like Psalms and Proverbs that are placed under the poetic wisdom literature. It's all about examining what the proper genre is for the context.
What are your reasons for not being a Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, or follower of one of the many other non-Christian faiths? Is it because you've devoted enormous time and energy to systematically investigating and debunking all these other religions? If you haven't done this, how can you in all honesty claim that your religion is superior? And if you're only a Christian because you happen to have been born into a Christian family, or you were raised in a culture or society where Christianity is commonplace, what about all the other people who, by a twist of fate, have been raised believing one of the many other religions that God has allowed to proliferate?
For one, I don't claim my religion is superior, hence making it some kind of competition. I think Christianity is the only consistent religion because I think it's the only one that's true. I don't consider much on partialities with other religions as if their theological beliefs are necessarily true. However, for the sake of argument, if I haven't systematically studied the many religions, how can I know mine is superior? Well, because every time I engage with somebody of that religion that I encounter, there's always an inconsistency in the religion or some error in the worldview of thought. I've engaged Muslims, a Sikh, maybe a Hindu, some Hebrew Israelites, and even a guy who claimed to be a modern prophet who was able to claim that his new religion was right because he's able to read God's message in everyday sound waves, and he's the only interpreter of such sound waves. So I've had my experience with such people, and I'm willing to change my beliefs if anybody can convince me. So far, no dice on that.
Kyle asked me to come up with a question for Christians.
Alright, Cranium, you better lay it on me.
I had a really hard time choosing just one. I mean, much of the Bible makes no sense at all, but I wanted to choose a question that really gets to the heart of the religion, and one that would apply to most, if not all, Christians, no matter their denomination. And so I decided to go with the supposed resurrection of Jesus Christ and the reason why he had to die in the first place. Here's my question. Why would an omnipotent, all-powerful God need a human sacrifice in order to forgive people their sins? If this being is truly capable of doing anything, has unlimited power and resources, and is all-loving, why would it require a brutal torture and killing? Why would it need a blood sacrifice and not just simply forgive people their sins? Especially if it knew their motivations and could judge people according to their intentions. This question has always baffled me, even when I was a Christian.
The issue is able to be answered in this way. While it is true God is able to forgive sins without the atonement occurring, for example, see Luke chapter 5 and 7, the atonement is a payment of wages. According to the Bible, sin is transgression against the law, and the wages, meaning the reward or the payment of sin, is death. This is according to the Bible, of course. However, Ray Comfort's speeding ticket analogy when he evangelizes is founded in the Bible, though I'm not sure camels were breaking any speeding laws back then, but that's besides the point. Anyways, you see that while sin is in the Bible treated like today's crimes of violating an established law, the results are the same, that a fine or a time must be paid to fit the crime. So Colossians chapter 2 verse 14 says, "The blotting out of the handwritten ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross." Now the Greek word used is exelaphio, which means the following according to Thayer's: to obliterate, erase, wipe, blot out. This refers to the handwriting of ordinances, otherwise known as the certificate of debt in our language, meaning in context that our sins are written up in a debt like the court of law today, and when the fine, the payment of our whole, wages that are written down on this sin debt, then once it's paid, the debt is blotted out, wiped out. So that's why it was needed, because a sin debt was there, and only the perfectly righteous Christ could pay it for us. Versus, as Isaiah chapter 64 verse 6 says when it mentions this. Now that would kind of be like using a filthy rag to clean a room when you focus on that verse in comparison to trying to atone for our own sins.
Variety of religions, from ancient Greek beliefs to Native American beliefs, both past and current, account for gods that have relationships with their believers and with their servants. Why do you feel like the relationship that you claim to have with Jesus Christ is somehow special or unique and somehow invalidates how all other believers feel about their gods and their connections with their gods?
So concerning this question, there's not much for me to really answer because I do not base my personal faith in terms of relationships and feelings. There is probably similarities within Christianity and other false gods in other aspects, but these are overgeneral concepts. That's like saying that if a god created the world and creation in the pagan worlds, then this means that there is a borrowing effect from that. So ultimately, I can only answer the question that matters to Christianity, and that is, why do I feel this relationship invalidates others? And it's simple, because not only is Christ alive, but he is also true in his claims and his deeds.
Hello everyone. In the Old Testament, God didn't like all the unrighteous people on earth. So why did God choose to get rid of all of them with a global flood? Presumably, he could have made them painlessly vanish with a silent snap of his immaterial fingers. And why, after flooding the whole earth, did God decide to hide all evidence of his act?
So I'm only going to answer the evidence of his question, because I've dealt with this issue already in detail in my video response to Cothrix whenever he brought this and other stories up. I don't think that God hid his act in terms of evidence. I affirm the local flood model, as for some of you that may know, both from scripture and science. I do not believe a global flood is in view when we see this text. So, for scriptural evidence, view my debate on the flood in the debate playlist as I lay out scriptural exegesis of the scriptures alongside my opponent who laid a global flood view. For the scientific evidence, you can also check out the National Center for Science Education article on this matter that said that if any flood is more likely that actually happened and has evidence for it, it would be the local flood. And I would have gone over another article and gone in much more extensive detail, but it seems that it was pulled down for it being, as far as I'm aware, a rough draft for a work to be peer-reviewed on the geological data to confirm the local flood in the region where Noah would have been, as well as the humans at that time were. I'm simply responding and even leaving resources for y'all to investigate, since you're asking the questions and y'all would like answers, and I will answer to the best of my ability, while also giving you more guidance to go and investigate for yourselves and not just simply take my word for it.
Why is it that the believers in every religion in history were wrong about their respective religion, despite having the same amount of conviction and evidence as you do for Christianity? It seems to me that you're already an atheist when it comes to all other religions in history, but somehow the one you happen to be born into is the one correct one.
They may have the same conviction, but that doesn't always mean it's right, so I don't see how conviction means anything. As for evidence, I fail to see much evidence for their religion, at least consistent evidence that supports their worldview or God being able to be in uniformity with reality. Islam may have evidence for the existence of Muhammad and his conquests, but there is no evidence that Muhammad split the moon into two distinct separate halves, or that the evidence that exists apparently of Jesus saying and doing the things that he did and said in the Quran either. This question sounds similar to the third and fifth questions asked earlier, so I will also refer back to the answers there.
If God is all-powerful and all-loving, why does he require blood in order to grant forgiveness? Old Testament or New, something had to die before he could forgive anyone. Human beings can forgive each other without there being a death first. Why can't God?
Part of this has already been answered to Godless Cranium's questions. Oh my goodness, I feel like this is sort of a repeat here. As to why he couldn't just simply forgive like we humans do. Simple. He can and does forgive without blood atonement. The question is the payment of the sins for reconciliation through death, of which if he didn't allow here to be an atonement or payment, he would simply be like Allah in Islam and be unjust. Or it would simply be like letting a rapist go free of his crime because the judge or family forgives the man in court. It's paying the sin debt of which I explained earlier, otherwise he wouldn't be an all-just or holy God. For a rhino with tough skin, I was expecting the question to be just as tough.
If you've never been to the ends of the earth, if you've never been to every planet, if you've never been to the corners of the universe, how do you know other gods don't exist?
I would ask the same of you in concern with your atheism, but I am not in the question interrogation mode at this point. So I'll just respond, since that is what I have to do and what, formally follows on this. As a Christian, I haven't been able to visit these other realms. After all, I am just human. But we believe in somebody who has been to all of these parts and has this knowledge in which he has revealed to us about if there are other gods. Now, in terms of gods, quote unquote, I do believe in the existence of other entities that the Bible refers to as gods, but they aren't gods in the sense that we use and understand them as, but only in the context of ancient Israelite supernaturalism. For example, Psalm chapter 82 mentions the plurality of these other gods in the divine council, of which Dr. Michael Heiser has published a book on this topic, and many scholarly peer-reviewed articles on this paper as well. So how do we deal with this? Simple. These are the sons of God mentioned in Job. These are the special class of divine beings that are even higher in the hierarchy of these angels that we see in the Bible, but they're also lesser in the hierarchy in comparison to Yahweh. So while these gods may exist, they aren't Yahweh, and instead are more like a divine being like angels, which just dwell within heaven, and some even reside in the idols that are crafted for them. Hence why one of the 10 Commandments says, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above." It's not just in reference to Yahweh here, but even to the divine council members, even to these Elohim, these gods.
There are thousands of other religions out
Oh snap! One of the stick drawings I drew in high school just became an atheist!
there, many of which have millions of followers. So according to your logic and theirs, anyone who is a blasphemer to your particular deity is going to be condemned, whether it is to go to hell or to be reincarnated as a less intelligent animal. If your God is true, why is it that he would even allow the minds of humans to be so easily deceived into believing other religions? He essentially would have created brains that can be fooled and ultimately will send these people down to hell. In addition, how do you know you're not one of the people who have been fooled?
For this I'll answer with scripture by citing Romans 9. Therefore hath he mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will he hardeneth. Thou wilt say then unto me, why doth he yet find fault? For who hath resisted his will? Nay, but O man, who art thou that repliedst against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why hast thou made me thus? Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor, and another unto dishonor? What if God, willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory, and on the vessels of mercy he had afore prepared unto glory, even us, whom he hath called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. As to the question about whether or not I know that I am part of these deceived individuals or not, that knowledge itself belongs to God, as noted about the secret things in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29. However, I have an assurance of being not deceived and saved versus certainty. This assurance is supported not only by the consistency of the Christian worldview, but also in the fruits of the Spirit as mentioned in the book of Galatians, as well as belief in Romans.
Truth doesn't fear curiosity, testing, or doubt, which inoculate us against charlatans and scams. But if your beliefs stand up to scrutiny, then why is doubting Thomas vilified as the bad guy for utilizing the scientific method?
Wait a second. Where is doubting Thomas vilified as the bad guy? He just doubts and wants evidence for the claim of Jesus' resurrection. Nowhere did he get criticized or treated like he was the bad guy for it. Now, Peter at times was accused of being Satan and even shamed for lack of faith about walking on water when Jesus would allow him to. So we don't see this language at the same time, though, being utilized towards Thomas by the disciples or Jesus. So I don't see how he's being vilified as the bad guy in this scenario for using the scientific method. Matter of fact, there's a Bible verse that, promotes the scientific method.
In most sections of Christian theology, there's typically one of two afterlives you'll get into when you die. There might be different subsects of this, but generally speaking, there are these main two ones: heaven or hell. So my question would be, why would you want either of those? Let me lay it out. You can either go to heaven and have no free will.
Boy, why?
Or you can go to hell and burn forever. Take your pick. If you go to heaven, everything's happy at all times, which means you're not allowed to feel sadness.
What's wrong with you people?
You'll be worshiping God until the end of days, and there's going to be no end of days, so it's going to keep going forever and ever, which means you effectively have no will of your own.
Alrighty then.
You are forced to worship this deity until who knows when. Now, if you go to hell, then you're going to be burning forever, but at least you have your free will. In neither of these are you given a choice or a chance to be anything but what you will be shaped and molded into. In both of these, you will effectively be a slave, whether you have your free will and you're burning and tortured, or you have no free will and thus are effectively stuck in unending servitude. I don't believe either of these places exist, and I have no reason to believe either of these places exist. But it seems that a lot of Christian theists want these places to exist. And my question would have to be, why? Both of them sound absolutely abysmal.
Now my response is, well, that's stupid.
I don't want or desire these places to exist. I only believe they exist because it's a fact. To me, denying the existence of these places would be like denying the reality of biological evolution due to the evidence for it, or even denying gravity because of the evidence for it. So it's not because I want to, but because it's a reality. This is even in the mind of other theologians and Christian philosophers, including conservative John Frame, who mentions this topic in his systematic theology book. Also, I don't understand where you get that hell allows for free will, but yet heaven doesn't allow for free will. I'd like to know where you get this concept from, because nowhere does it speak on the limit of ability in there. It, however, says, for example, in Revelation chapter 21, verse 4, "And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away." So it says people won't be crying because there is no pain. While this is an application, of course, to the new heavens, I don't see why this would not have been carried over from the old heavens. Matter of fact, believers in Christ who repented and have gone through regeneration and sanctification have become the new man, as spoken of in Ephesians chapter 4. We put away the old on earth and put on the new on earth, which means our desires change if it is new versus old. Meaning it's not against our will, since our will and our desires at that time will be to praise, to worship, and avoid sin. So I really don't see what the problem is here.
Both of us believed in God.
It meant everything to us. It colored how we saw the world. It gave us meaning, and it gave us strength.
Then one day, we couldn't. We had questions, we had doubts, and they couldn't be answered.
We searched, we wanted to, and we tried. We struggled to make ourselves believe again, but we couldn't pretend we did without knowing that it was a lie.
So here's our question.
Can a person simply choose to believe in something that they are not convinced of?
If not, and God created our brains to require a certain level of evidence in order to be convinced, why has He chosen to not provide that level of evidence for us?
Even though we both wanted to believe.
Well, certainly a person can, choose to believe in something they aren't convinced of. There are cases this is done all the time. But as to Paulogia's question, I believe he has left plenty of evidence, as noted in Romans chapter 1 concerning creation, along with the existence of Jesus Christ and the historical data supporting what he did throughout the gospel. But in case you don't like that approach, then at least give Inspiring Philosophy's video a look entitled "Why There Is No Proof for God." I used to be very convinced by this, and this was one of the things that helped me lead towards Christianity even more. Okay, guys, stop looking at me. Stop staring at me.
Often, creationists will characterize the Big Bang as something magically created from nothing. But then you have creationists who literally believe a supernatural being created the entire universe. Literally something magically from nothing. My question to you is why is the first one irrational but the second one logical?
I'm not even going to respond here. We have the same agreement, which is why I, as a creationist, would say God is the one who created the universe from nothing, using the Big Bang as his means of bringing about creation. So when I hear and read of Big Bang, it reminds me of Genesis chapter 1.
We atheists get asked all the time what the basis of our morality is.
It's Kyle from NonSequitur. This might be hard for me, but then again, I did promise I'd try to sweep him off his feet with surprises.
Anarchist, man. I am.
Okay.
I'm blown away right now. I'm very rarely speechless, but I'm speechless right now.
I'm glad I could do that. Trust me, I can do more ways to sweep you off your feet and leave you breathless.
Isn't it? That sounds sexy. But isn't? Yeah.
You
you
assume
guys want your own room. We can go away. I don't mind.
You assume that. Don't see dirty thoughts, you
What are you
pervert.
doing after the stream?
Yeah.
It's as if because we don't have some holy book or we don't worship a god, we have no true way of having a moral compass.
No, it's not because you lack belief in a god or some kind of a holy book. At least that's not why I and other apologists would ask the question. I'll respond later, though.
Call me crazy, but I don't think you have to have the promise of heaven to see that doing good is just good.
Agreed, but what is the standard for the definition of good?
Well, the basis for my morality is simple. I believe that doing the most good and the least harm benefits not only me, but those around me. I believe that things like kindness and love and laughter benefit not only me, but those around me. However, I also believe that things like judgment, condemnation, and a willful ignorance to follow something that has no basis set in reality or backed up by evidence is ultimately harmful. And not only to me, but to those around me.
I understand that, but that still doesn't answer the question. Because while you say the basis for your morality is doing the most good and less harm, which can benefit about anybody, including yourself and those around you, the issue of the question deals with how do you define what is good and wrong? Is it subjective that you decide, for example, that saving a drowning kitten is good when you have the ability to do so? How can we determine that ignoring the cat's plea for help is bad? I believe everybody, including you and me, have the ability to determine that it is good and that we know for a fact it's good to save the kitty from drowning. I believe that the basis for this is that God has established a moral law that is natural, and we have this knowledge of right or wrong in our hearts. So I believe God is the standard, not really the book or anything else, but that God alone is the standard.
So for my question, I'd like to turn the tables.
Boy.
What's the basis for your morality?
Well, I just said what the basis is for my morality.
Is it the Bible? Is it really the Bible? That same Bible that doesn't condemn slavery or rape. Instead, it says things like, if your daughter is raped, she should marry her attacker. Or, if you're a slave owner, and you find yourself in the situation where your slave is unruly, you are within your right to beat him within an inch of his life. So many scriptures, 66 books, filled with thousands of pages, hundreds of thousands of words, but not one of which says that rape or slavery is morally wrong. So what's the basis for your morality again?
Alright, well, you didn't look hard enough out of all those words and pages of the Bible that you mentioned by number, which we do actually have verses that contain a condemnation of these actions, by the way. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 25, for example, says, "But if a man find a betrothed damsel in the field, and the man forces her, and lie with her, then the man only that lay with her shall die." The Hebrew word being used for force is shazak. This means to seize and to take by force. Thus, this is the context of rape. What is the penalty of this action? According to the verse, it would be death. So it's clearly condemned here. By the way, what do you think adultery is? Rape can include adultery and lusting after somebody, especially by force. And then, we also, not to mention, have a condemnation of slavery. Exodus chapter 21, verse 16 says, And he that stealeth a man, and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, so meaning after he steals him, then deciding to sell him, or if he still happens to be in the possession of the person that is trying to sell or just keep a person that he stole, he shall surely be put to death. This sounds like a clear condemnation of slavery right here, so let's deal with the verses that he mentioned. He is mistaken in thinking Deuteronomy chapter 22 verses 28 through 29 deals with the marrying of a rapist. Rape implies it was against the will of the lady. While some translations have it translated here for supposedly rape in some of these verses, the Hebrew word for this is tafas, which means lay a hold of or wield, and it's used in Genesis chapter 4 verse 21 as well as Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 8 as a more gentle hold, as even the lexicons themselves and the concordances will note. For example, in terms of Genesis chapter 4 verse 21, it's referring to someone holding a harp as they play it. Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 8 is in reference to someone holding on to the Torah. So that's not really a good case if we're trying to say that's by rape, by force here with the Hebrew word tafas. Another issue is the fact that it says wa nimasau. May have butchered that in the Hebrew, but this means and they are found. According to the Old Testament scholar Edward J. Woods, in page 242 of the Tyndale Old Testament commentaries, we read the following, quote, "The terminology here is different than in the case of rape in verses 25 to 27, which points rather to a case of seduction with the expression, quote, and they are discovered, verse 28b. If they are discovered, then the man is obligated to marry the girl and is prevented from ever divorcing her, verse 29b, unquote. Now, in verse 29, the Hebrew anah, otherwise meaning humbled or defiled in English, refers in this context, because it is there, is in reference to consensual sex, meaning this is an agreement between these people. And in the context here, Deuteronomy chapter 21 verse 14 explains a similar kind of context almost, and we see that it's used there, though most of your translations will say humiliated and defiled. I again want to focus on the Hebrew, and you can determine the Hebrew as well by looking at the surrounding context. The surrounding context indicates that this is about a marriage and consensual relationship in that act involving defiling of the virginity of the person. Plus, here's the other thing to keep in mind as well. Marriage was basically a way to help the woman, since if a woman had lost her virginity in that culture and was unmarried, then the culture would see her as an outcast. And like some people today, some guys today especially, they would not hesitate to run away from responsibility. This system was used to make sure not only that the man took responsibility and accountability for his actions, but that the woman may be able to support herself and have a well-being place in society, especially in a society that is around other cultures and these other surrounding nations that they may have to visit. Next is concerning the slave passage. The Hebrew word for slave is abed, and slave is not actually a very good translation for this word. Much like other Hebrew words that have new insight, yet there are people that refuse to translate it properly due to the traditional scheme of translating for the sake of selling your translation. Now, the term abed is not a term that would be used to describe what we know today as a slave. It's actually an honorable term towards somebody. Even the transaction of slaves, which were much like football or renegade workers who get traded, this is something we are known about. The word should be more accurately rendered as servant or worker, as some translations do this, but it's where. Same goes for the owner, also known in the Hebrew as anan. They would be like the boss or team owner, hardly what we would call slavery today. As for the beating, the owner could easily just be punishing somebody for a certain action. Notice also the issue about he's using a rod. He's only permitted to use a rod in terms of weapons. As John Gill notes, an old Jewish targum, meaning a Jewish tradition in terms of interpretation and how to live out the Jewish life in terms of this context, this Jewish targum of Jonathan says, quote, only with a rod for the correction of them, and not with a sword or any such destroying weapon, which would seem as though he intended to kill. So certain destroying weapons were forbidden because they wanted to preserve the life of these servants. They wanted to prevent intentional killings or any way of allowing this person to intentionally die. And this is according to the interpretation of the Jews under the Targum of Jonathan. So there is much more on this and other verses on slavery in general that exegetical apologetics, formerly known as Reformed Apologetics Ministries, has done on this, called The Bible and Slavery. Links to this and the rest of the resources that I kind of mentioned will be listed in the description below. So to answer your question again, my basis for morality is in God. I hope this was helpful. I am not expecting it to be satisfactory to everybody, but to some it might, and others it might open up a forum of conversation that is good for us to have. So let me know what you think. But until then, this has been The Christian Anarchist. Have a good day.